Isn't that kind? You can hear me. Fantastic. Hey, everyone. How you doing? Super awesome to be here. I'm so excited. Our first Compose, of course, right? We did Jamstack for a number of years, and this is all about how composable architecture has really arrived, what it looks like, how it's different when it arrives in enterprises, and what stays the same. So yeah, quick introduction to me. I'm Chris. I spent all my time on composable architecture, on Jamstack, on this decoupling of the web, right? I sit on a number of advisory and executive boards in our ecosystem, including the Market Alliance, where Netlify helped create the enabler category, where I sit on the executive board there and spend a bunch of time on sort of how should the certificates and the approach be, and how do we educate the market in the best way. I also spend a bunch of time at the angel investment in the ecosystem, everything around the ecosystem and pushing it forward, which is of course a big part of Netlify's story as well, right? Before this, I spent 15 years in agencies, struggling with a bunch of the things that we're collectively, us at Netlify and everyone here, whether you're at SIs or championing it internally in a company, or you're in a tech partner, are trying to solve for. And then I do love old movies and modern jazz. I spent my path here was through studying film history, which is of course super relevant, right? Well, maybe not super relevant, but it's still fun. Of course, we are here not to talk about that, but to talk about composable architecture as a digital strategy. Now, just to recap, right? When we started Netlify, the notion was to decouple the web. Like that's where it started, right? And there was a few reasons for that. One was that it would enable multiple points of origin, right? It would make it much more scalable. It would make it much faster. It would sort of migrate away those large surface areas of attack. It would also give the developer superpowers, right? This notion that the front-end developer only would cut out sort of Photoshop files and send them off for implementation was already being proven wrong, right? They were doing more and more advanced applications, but they were still sort of left to implement into the back-end systems, and that's where, and I saw that in agencies, that's where all the deadlines and milestones went to die, right? Is when things had to go to IT and tickets were formed, and you might or might not hear back. But what we saw, and on top of that was this path to composable architecture that could be paved. It starts with the decoupling, but at scale for enterprises, the big value add is this interchangeability, of course, right? The notion that you don't have to build an entire new monolith and spend years migrating to it just because you wanted different analytics or content editing capabilities, whatever, but you could have that as components and you could change just that part. Now, of course, when we looked at this and looked at it, it seemed like, well, this is just a fundamentally better way to build, right? Like there's so many advantages for the individual developers and for the businesses that foot the bill. So why wasn't everyone doing it? And at core, the reason was there was no viable ecosystem, right? And so you can't build a headless commerce solution if there's no headless commerce provider. And there was no viable workflows. Once you had all those different disparate components, how would they fit together? What was the developer workflow and the unified release management and so on that went into it? And of course, that translated into us being able to basically cater logs or if there were ever any big solutions that were extremely self-architected. And so today, that has fundamentally changed, right? That's why we're here, and that's why it's Netlify Compose now rather than just focusing on that entry level, right? It's because we have an ecosystem. There's more than 3,500 companies here. That includes a ton of the existing legacy providers that have modernized themselves, that have leaned into headless and microservice offerings as well, right? And the viable workflows, well, the front-end clouds and that we're building has very much been solidified. It's very much a standard. Today, something like Deploy Preview is like, well, that's how you build for the web. Well, that was just the name we came up with back in the day, right? Like these standards have really been well established. And so, of course, that also means that we can support very complex use cases. If you just think about it as a standalone, there's basically nothing we can't build today. And that also has translated into a huge appetite for composable amongst enterprises. As Matt was talking about earlier, that's only exploding. We're up to, I think in January, Gartner was saying that 70% of all enterprises wanted to build composable this year, or was going to. And so, why is this happening? Why are enterprises looking to adopt composable architecture? Of course, there's a number of reasons. But when I'm out there and I'm speaking to CMOs or technical directors, whoever it is that's responsible for adopting this, I see the same sort of reasoning come up again and again and again. The biggest one here is faster time to market. Right? You have so many digital touch points. Today is a place where most business problems have digital solutions. And so if you want to execute something, it has a big digital component. If that means waiting 4 months because of monolithic systems on just not being able to do that, that's something that's becoming harder and harder to tolerate for most businesses. Another thing is, of course, the operational overhead. I had one CMO for one of the largest financial institutions in the world say that one of the legacy providers had sold him everything he needed and everything he didn't. And there's, of course, a desire to, as you have all these digital touch points, to control costs. And then, of course, as we talked about, that big factor of interchangeability, the notion that you can have compartmentalized systems that work together with others rather than one big software monolith that does everything, and what you see is what you get. However, and this is where it gets real, right? There are some companies that are finding these promises really hard to cash in on. Right? I see it again and again, and I was in my workings with Mark. I was able to talk to a great number of them that actually had or was quite late stage in adopting headless projects. But we're saying back, hey, like we are struggling a little bit now. There can be many reasons for this, right? One of the big ones, and that doesn't matter what software you're adopting in a company. That can be that you are proliferation, right? We all seen it, like a company, 1 or 2 people adopt software, and there's no plan for expanding this, and so no one knows that it exists, or maybe it hasn't gone through the right processes of procurement internally in the company, and so on, so it's not existing. And that can also be another one, is of course that you were sold something that, let's face it, might have been a monolith selling you something that they called composable or headless. Maybe there was a microservice somewhere in that, right? But the reality is that you were sort of left with a monolith at the end of the day. But what was really interesting was that more than 90% of the time, it was for the same reasons, right? And so to really understand why these key delivery promises weren't delivered at scale, we have to understand how this category landed in enterprises. So when we started, as any tech ecosystem, doesn't matter if we're talking firmware for refrigerators or whatever, it starts with developers. It starts in a bottom-up movement, and these are developers that care mostly about technology, right? It's less about business outcomes. It's about what this technology can enable early on, which is great. Right? And so the adoption of this has a natural focus on the developer tooling and that early architecture. However, once it started landing in the early majority for these companies, it was very often borne by analysts that talked about business benefits, which is great. The audience also changed. It became more digital project owners, people that might not be coding themselves, or in most cases by far weren't. And so here, we lean more into the legacy way of buying, which is much more around components, right? And so when I talk about components here, I mean a content management system, I mean a digital commerce tool, which is great, right? And it is really important. So for composable success, there is absolutely no way around that you need best-in-class headless components, right? To the extent that if you want to be successful with it, the very promise of, and the premise of composable is to not use a monolith that dictates your choice for everything else. So let's say you're choosing a monolithic content management system. That also means that it's dictating your websites and your apps and your templates and build tool and programming language and you name it, right? By going headless, by choosing that component, it does what it does best, and then you're free to build separately for each of those digital touch points, right? And that's where we started at Market Alliance, which has a very clear enterprise focus. We talk a lot about this, right? The first leg has really been about what should those components look like, right? So if composable is the what, then Mark tried to come up with a how, right? So we talk about it has to be software as a service, it has to be multi-tenant, it has to be API first, microservice based, it has to be cloud native, and all these things are fantastic, right? But yet, as important as choosing the right component is if we look at those top 3 reasons why enterprises are leaning into composable replatforming, they have faster time to market, reducing overhead and interchangeability. 2 of those are not provided by choosing the right component alone. Right? To address time to market and reducing overhead, we need to look at how the actual architecture we employ and how we operate, maintain, publish, and orchestrate around those components. How does that look? And it can be a little frightening to really look at how does traditional publishing look, right? So if you look at these are not just separate steps. They have separate stakeholders, right? In a traditional waterflow way, these are different people with their own ticketing systems and their own ticketing queues, right? Their own sprints. And so the reality is you hand over for the design and the front end people say, okay, well, we created the ticket for that, it'll fit in the next sprint, right? Then you have back-end development, so you have system operations that have release engineering, you have testing for production, readiness, you of course setting up and maintaining staging environments, development and production environments, you might have database administrative reviews, you have Q&A as a separate step, then you have all your network and infrastructure engineering for caching and localization and so on, and you have these big end-state security scans. This is a very traditional way of publishing, right? And now you're adding on top of that composable architecture. So now you have to embrace something that does mean more vendors and standalone functions that needs orchestration as well. So great, you chose a best-in-class headless API, right? A first composable, API first composable commerce tool, for example, right? But if you don't adopt composable architecture, if you just do operations as usual, your time to market is still going to be just as excruciating as it always was. And so the reality is, and many of you here might know this already, but out there, so either stakeholders in your own companies or to the clients that you're selling to, they're not aware of this, right? Is that composable success really is, yes, you choose the right headless components, right? But you also need to consider the right composable architecture. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What does composable architecture mean? And of course, this can be a super expansive talk, right? There's lots of companies out there that have incredibly intricate systems and considerations. But if we zoom out and we look at it, at what this is, at the very heart of it, it is really about empowering developers, the ones that set these systems up, to actually move fast, to deploy directly without all those dependencies that I just mentioned. And then it's about trying to abstract and automate them away, and then actually integrate as much as this into the development process itself, which is this mega trend that has been going for a while, but is really a thing. And I want to talk about it as a thing, right? So when we talk about this, we normally talk about this as in 2 ways. One is as infrastructure as code, and the other is continuous everything. So infrastructure as code, right? This is abstracting away traditional hosting and operations, right? And so the last big change that we saw was, and I'm talking very broadly, of course, right? In our category was this step from on-prem to cloud. Now, you can very much argue that it's still going on, but I also think it's fair to argue that this has been a mega trend for more than a decade. Now, we did this for scalability and multitude of services, right? Someone like AWS can spin up a lot of EC2 service, right? And it makes perfect sense. And they're still super important, right? Also moving forward. But if you think about what this is, what it isn't, is operations. You still had operations as usual, right? And so you have to remember that even though it's moved to the cloud, you still have all those huge teams that have to build out, operate, maintain, and orchestrate everything yourself, right? So you can think of a traditional infrastructure cloud as a Home Depot. You can get anything you want, but you still sort of have to build it out. Now, and I'm talking about the traditional parts of infrastructure clouds, right? So today, however, when this started out, we had much fewer services, and we had 1 or 2 digital touch points that we had to cater. Now, the digital services have absolutely exploded, and you're not supporting 1 or 2, but but sometimes dozens and sometimes even thousands of different digital touch points, right? And so the way of doing this in a traditional manner is no longer scalable. It isn't tenable. You have to think about it differently because the overhead that this is create is massive. Today, an average enterprise spends more than 50% of their budgets is, if we're honest, right, keeping the lights on. That is maintenance and operations of the system. There's no new functionality in that. I was just last week sitting down with a CEO and a CIO of a company that had a digital budget, an IT budget of $120 million a year, and they said $85 million was spent just in operations, right? Just because they had so many legacy systems and there's so much overhead in just keeping it running. Now, as we discussed before, this is not just an overhead from a resources point of view, it is also what costs you time to market. If you're looking for a single reason on why you have a slow time to market, this is it. 9 out of 10 times. It's vast infrastructure engineering and the use of monolithic software suites. And so this is why, moving forward, I do believe, and I see more and more supported out there, that a main goal for enterprises is to automate and abstract their way of their own infrastructure. Right? I honestly believe that adopting composable architecture and abstracting and automating of infrastructure directly will carry a larger impact on your organization than anything else. Now, that's why this next step of the evolution of the cloud is platforms like a composition platform that does this, right? It's also why you see so many companies and so many C-suites really trying to lean into AI, both to understand it, but also to really wrap around the application of it internally and the possibilities. In our world, I dare to say that AI, for us in this context, is abstracting and automating away what used to be manual, right? So we're not talking about managed services, right? This is not to a SaaS company, not to a consultancy, not to your own large IT teams. Rather, we're talking about turning all that infrastructure and operation into code, right? It's not about being better at setting varnish caching or better error handling for infrastructure teams or, guarding against securities or putting up more money aside for SaaS staging environments and so on, right? It's about taking all of that functionality and then by architecture, turning it into a little bit of JavaScript that can lie in a repo, right? That's how you scale. And so I think this is really incredibly important, right? And of course, this is where we see the ultimate value of Composable, right? A future where you focus on building and innovating and leaving operation and maintenance into the hands of the right tooling. Right, so abstracting away maintenance and operations, focus on building and innovating, true lightning fast time to market, and significant double-digit savings on overall digital budgets. That's what we're seeing from the clients that are not just embracing Composable for a greenfield project, but more as a strategy across their organization. Now, the other part of this is once you've done this, once you've taken all those steps and the dependencies from an infrastructure point of view and you turn it into code, then you can really lean into what we call continuous everything. Now, if you think about it, it's this old way of releasing in really big coordinated events, right? It's this notion where we now have continuous deploy, and every time you touch anything, you push code to Git, you actually get a deploy preview back, a finished URL. It's built out, it's done, right? But we're also seeing all kinds of other startups and tooling and services embrace this. For example, continuous code quality feedback, right? Where you're more or less real time getting that feedback back all the time. Right? That's when you should fix it, not at the very end in the QA step. The same goes for error monitoring. The same goes for using something like Slick if you're scanning for security vulnerabilities, right? And dependencies. And all those automatic staging environments and all that thing you had to set up before, well, we're already used to using something like Netlify and you just have it. It's by default. Like you get a URL back. There is no staging environment. It's just done, right? And so the idea here is that it's all there all the time. Right? So if you lean into this as a philosophy almost for how you run IT and digital projects, that's really where you start being able to remove this, right? And so the results, and I think Matt talked to this earlier as well, right? We made this the survey where we figured out that our enterprise clients before joining Netlify publish, and this is being generous because the real number is probably even fewer, but once per week. Now, mind you, that's a hell of a lot better than a few years ago when it was once a quarter, right? But on average, they deploy to productions with Netlify 28 times a day. Now, of course, our software is not 150 times faster. Not at all. but it's the notion that it abstracts away all those steps that I just talked about by automation, right? It's because you're at the same time using that tooling that becomes part of the development process. That's how you can get that, right? That's where you can go to as a marketer, your front-end developer, and not have them say, well, maybe we're ready in 4 months, and you're saying, but I don't get it. Right? I'm asking you to move something up above the fold. I mean, come on, right? But that's not because it takes their work 4 months. It's because there's like 7 other functions that have to be coordinated and have to be in office and have to be timed and have to have the right infrastructure available and so on. So the benefit of doing this, and when you really start to lean into the benefits of Composable, comes when you start thinking about this architecture and orchestration, when you start abstracting away infrastructure as code, and when you start leaning in to continuous everything. Now, moving forward, what I want to talk about lastly here in the last few minutes is today we have an ecosystem that's mature enough again that if you use those best practices that I just talked about and components, best-in-class components, you can basically build any single project, right? That's fantastic for greenfield exercise. However, right, the last step of maturing this category has to become, when does it become much more of a digital strategy, right? And that means that you're not just having a single team with a single responsibility, let's say for e-commerce, but it's much more sort of a high-level thing. And so again, we have to look at how does the audience change. Right now, we have CIOs and chief enterprise architects amongst that audience. And now they're going to care not at all about, let's say, a front-end framework or something. That's way out of their purview, but they will care about broad orchestration. They will care about operational overhead of infrastructure spend. And all of this comes down to business outcomes, right? And has to be translated into that. So they're not going to be in a position where they're just optimizing for a single digital project. And that's often where Composable has stopped. So that's why it's hard to get in there, because they'll just push you and say, well, these people might need a new marketing website, so go and talk to them, right? So how do we enter that conversation? And I think we have to understand there's a number of new needs that arises. So these are just some of them, right? We have visual editing and personalization, as we talked about. What happens if you're all of a sudden saying, well, I have multiple different content sources? This has been very, very soulful, but always part of a singular component, not as a standalone layer that pulls in from many content sources. And you also need viable ways of reusing components and human resources across what used to be siloed projects. Let's say you're selling an enterprise, you're selling a fitness bike, right? And that has an app on it that streams video and so on. And you might also have, a big.com with lots of enterprise stakeholders, and you have multiple marketing sites that are one-off, and you have developer documentation and all these things, because the business logic and the data need was so different. It used to be completely siloed. They weren't even aware that each other existed. Now they're reusing design systems and components and all those things across that. So we also need to talk about how does that impact and what does the change management and so on look like in that. But most importantly, and this is what we can't get around, we need to figure out how do we incorporate existing tech stacks and not just say they smell. We have to be aware that at this point, when you go into a larger enterprise, they can't just be changed overnight. They have large existing operations, and they need common workflows that encompass both greenfield and existing tech stacks overnight. And that's, of course, why we made Netlify Composable web platform. That's why we added this third layer of Netlify. We had the front-end cloud that abstracted away hosting, that added developer workflow, right? Where you can get unified release management and so on. But we also needed this next layer where you could have content API orchestration with multiple sources, including things that were legacy, right? Where you could have layers of creation that could cater again, multiple content sources, right? Where you're basically providing a workflow that spans more than that singular stack. And so that's why we're so excited to stand here today, because we truly believe that this can help engage a part of the organization that otherwise, where you're out there and saying, well, they come back in 3 years when our subscription up for renewal, there's actually a way to get started with them. There's to say, well, let's optimize what you already have, provide the right workflows and platform, and give you an opportunity to migrate gradually into composable platforms and use the best-in-class native tech partners there, like all the fantastic headless CMSs and commerce systems and so on, right? Now, the takeaway slide here to wrap up, there has to be one of those, right? Is really, first of all, adopt composable solutions. Right? There is no way around it today. There's a reason why those numbers are so high for Gartner and so on. And even though there are challenges, if you employ best practices, you really will have so much better performance and higher conversion rates and everything else that you're looking for as a modern digital business. There's no way around it. Composable solutions are here to stay. They're becoming table stakes by the minute, and you have to embrace it to stay competitive. Number two, reduce time to market and operational overhead. And a way to do that is something like Netlify's composable web platform. You have to take how you consider your operations and your architecture into the equation. Otherwise, you just won't get there. And lastly, this notion of continuous everything. I bet you if you turn around and look at what you're doing today, you're already employing a lot of these best practices, but being mindful of it to really start seeing how can we have that as a goal inside the organization of what can we take as an end state today with separate ticket writers, right, and separate stakeholders, and put that in to something that's much more part of the development process. And with that, I leave you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of the journey. Thank you for to all our fantastic partners and all our fantastic clients and everyone here from Netlify. It's such a pleasure. I hope to continue another decade doing this. Thank you so much.